The Haunted Forest. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. The forest was dense, its towering trees casting deep shadows that seemed to stretch forever. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp leaves and moss, and a heavy silence blanketed the woods, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. Lily stood at the edge of the forest, her heart racing, a feeling of unease creeping up her spine. She had heard the rumors, the stories whispered by the locals about the haunted forest. But tonight, she had decided to venture in, determined to prove to herself that there was nothing to fear. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, illuminating the twisted, gnarled trunks of the trees that seemed to reach for the sky like skeletal arms. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath her boots the only sound as she moved deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches intertwining above, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. Lily had grown up in this small town, and the stories of the haunted forest had always intrigued her. They spoke of strange happenings, of people who had entered and never returned, of voices in the wind and ghostly apparitions that wandered the woods at night. The older generations spoke in hushed tones, warning the young to stay away, but Lily was no stranger to curiosity. She had to see for herself. There was no way something as ridiculous as a haunted forest could be real. The deeper she walked, the more the sense of foreboding grew. Her skin prickled, and she felt as though eyes were watching her from the darkness. The air grew colder, and the wind seemed to pick up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. She paused for a moment, trying to shake the feeling, but the whispers only grew louder, more distinct. They weren't coming from the trees. They weren't even coming from the wind. They were coming from the forest itself, as though the earth beneath her feet was speaking, murmuring words just out of reach. Her pulse quickened. She strained to hear, but the voices remained a mystery. Something felt wrong. She turned to look over her shoulder, but all she saw was the dark path she had traveled, leading back to the town, so far away now. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as if it were pressing down on her chest. The sound of a twig snapping echoed through the stillness, sending a jolt of fear through her body. Lily whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just trees. The shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper, and the wind shifted direction. She could hear it now more clearly, like soft footsteps behind her, pacing her every movement. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer came. Her eyes scanned the darkness, but there was no sign of movement. The whispering, though, continued, growing louder now, clearer. They were words she couldn't understand, an ancient language that seemed both foreign and familiar at the same time. She could almost feel the words in her bones, vibrating through the air. The voices sounded close, too close, and Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She took another step, then another, but with each one, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging her forward. It was as if the forest itself were pulling her in, drawing her deeper into its twisted heart. The wind howled, and for a moment, Lily thought she saw something move in the darkness ahead. A figure, just beyond the trees, standing still and silent. Her breath caught in her throat, and she froze. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but there was something unnerving about its stillness, like it was waiting, watching her. With a deep breath, she forced herself to move forward. She had to see what it was. She had to know if it was real or just her mind playing tricks on her. The figure didn't move as she drew closer, but the whispers around her grew louder, more frantic, as though they were trying to warn her. She stepped carefully, her eyes never leaving the shape ahead. It was human-shaped, tall, but its features were blurred, indistinct, like the shadows themselves were consuming it. Then, just as she was within a few feet of it, the figure turned to face her. Lily gasped, her heart leaping in her chest. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, voids of darkness. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out, only the whispers, now growing even more frantic. Lily stumbled back, her hand pressed to her chest, struggling to breathe. Her mind raced. This was no ordinary woman. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, Lily thought she saw something ancient, something filled with sorrow and rage, deep within them. Without thinking, Lily turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth as she raced through the forest, branches scraping at her skin, the cold air stinging her face. She could hear the whispers behind her, growing louder still, as if they were chasing her, following her every step. Her heart was in her throat, and her lungs burned as she ran faster, the fear propelling her forward. But the forest seemed endless. The trees blurred together, and the path ahead grew darker, more winding, as if the woods themselves were shifting, changing, trying to confuse her. The wind howled, and for a moment, the whispers stopped, leaving only the sound of her frantic breathing. She dared to glance over her shoulder, but there was nothing. No figure, no presence. Only the dense, silent forest. For a brief second, she thought she had escaped. But then, the ground beneath her feet shifted. She stumbled, her foot catching on something unseen, and she fell forward, crashing onto the ground. Her hands scraped against the rough earth, but she quickly pushed herself up, panic surging in her chest. When she looked down, she saw that her hands were covered in something dark, something wet. Blood. Fresh blood. She gasped, her heart pounding, and looked around. The ground beneath her was shifting, opening. It was as if the earth itself was alive, the soil parting in jagged cracks. From within these cracks, pale, gnarled hands reached out, their fingers long and twisted, scraping at the air. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent, more desperate. The hands grasped at her, pulling her toward the opening in the earth. Her scream was caught in her throat as she struggled, trying to pull away, but the hands were too strong. With a final, desperate scream, Lily managed to free herself, scrambling backward, away from the grasping hands. She didn't stop running this time. She couldn't. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing against her, their twisted branches reaching for her like skeletal arms. The whispers were everywhere now. They were in her ears, in her mind. The voices grew frantic, their words unintelligible, but the fear in them was undeniable. "Help us!" Lily ran until she couldn't breathe, her legs burning, but the forest seemed endless, the path never ending. She didn't know how much time had passed. Hours, maybe. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on her, suffocating her, but she couldn't stop. Finally, she saw the edge of the forest. The dark outline of the town, just beyond the trees. Her heart leaped. She was almost there. But when she emerged from the woods, she stopped dead in her tracks. The town was gone. The houses, the streets, the lights, everything was gone, replaced by a vast, endless expanse of trees. She was back in the forest, standing at the very place where she had entered. The whispers had stopped. The forest was silent now, but Lily knew, deep in her bones, that it would never be silent again. She would never leave. Lily stood frozen at the edge of the forest, her chest heaving, as the oppressive silence around her began to feel like a weight on her body. The town she thought she had seen, the one she believed was just beyond the trees, was nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed it whole, leaving only the dark expanse of gnarled trees and shadows in its place. The air had grown thick, heavy with the same unnatural chill that had gripped her the moment she stepped into the woods. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no more energy to run. She felt an overwhelming sense of defeat, as though the forest had already claimed her. She looked behind her, only to see the same endless sea of trees that she had been trying to escape. No path, no sign of the town. Just the woods. It was then that the whispering returned, but this time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't an eerie murmur just on the edge of her consciousness. No, this time, it was right in front of her, all around her. She could hear the voices clearly, each word dripping with despair and sorrow. "Come closer." Her breath hitched. She knew it was the forest speaking to her, but it wasn't the wind or the trees. The voices were coming from deep within the earth, from something far older, far darker than the woods themselves. She instinctively took a step back, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, to tremble. The trees, too, seemed to move. She thought she saw one of them sway, a branch snapping unnaturally, its form stretching, elongating, as if it were a living creature rather than just a tree. But when she blinked, it returned to normal, leaving her wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. Lily's thoughts raced, trying to find a way out, any way to escape this nightmare. She looked for the town again, but it was still gone, replaced by this twisted, unnatural forest that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Desperation clawed at her throat. What is this place? Her legs felt weak. Every part of her body screamed to leave, to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She could feel the pull of the forest, tugging at her, urging her deeper into its grasp. Her eyes flickered across the trees, and that's when she saw them. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast to be anything real. But then, more shadows emerged, and Lily could see them more clearly, shapes, humanoid in form, but twisted, distorted. Figures that didn't belong in the natural world. They were creatures of the forest, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their mouths wide and grotesque, their bodies covered in patches of moss and decay. She took a step back, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs refused to obey. The figures crept forward, emerging from the shadows, their movements unnatural and jerky, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. Their eyes were locked on Lily, their hollow gazes unblinking, filled with hunger and sorrow. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped closer to her. It was a woman, her face pale, almost translucent, her features sharp and elongated. Her mouth opened, and the whispering intensified, filling Lily's mind with unintelligible words. The woman's arms stretched unnaturally long, her fingers gnarled and claw-like. She reached out to Lily, her voice a low, guttural croon. "You cannot leave." The words echoed in Lily's head, reverberating like a heartbeat. Her body trembled, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. The figure's grip on her grew tighter, and her vision blurred, the edges of the forest warping and twisting. "No." Lily whispered, her voice breaking, barely audible over the whispers. "Please. I just want to go home." But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached forward, its long, bony fingers brushing against Lily's face. The touch was ice cold, sending a shock of terror through her. The woman's eyes flickered with an ancient hunger, and Lily could feel the pull of the forest deepen. It was as though the trees themselves were breathing, their roots twisting beneath her feet, dragging her closer to the center of the woods. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Lily pulled herself away from the woman's grasp. She turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, the figures of the forest creeping after her. The whispering was deafening now, surrounding her from all sides, urging her to stop, to give in. But Lily pushed forward, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath ragged and uneven. She didn't dare look behind her. She couldn't afford to. The forest was alive, its twisted, malevolent presence all around her. It was watching her, following her, hunting her. Her mind screamed for escape, but the path before her was endless, winding, and she could no longer tell if she was running in circles. Every turn felt the same. The trees loomed closer, their branches growing thicker, their shadows longer, more suffocating. The whispers seemed to grow louder, drowning out her thoughts, until she could no longer tell if they were real or if they had become part of her own mind. And then, as if by some twisted design, the forest split before her. A small clearing appeared, bathed in pale moonlight. Lily hesitated, her breath ragged, her pulse still racing. But something in the clearing called to her, an instinct she couldn't explain. She stepped into the clearing, her eyes darting around. For a moment, there was silence. The air felt different here still, but heavy with the weight of something ancient and forgotten. She could feel the presence of something in the air, something that watched her from the shadows just beyond the moonlit circle. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled. Lily froze, her eyes widening as the earth shifted, cracks appearing in the soil, sending a chill down her spine. From within the cracks, long, twisting roots shot upward, thick as tree trunks, twisting and coiling like serpents. They seemed to be reaching for her, pulling her toward the center of the clearing. Her blood ran cold as she realized the truth: the forest wasn't just alive. It was a trap. A living, breathing entity that consumed those who dared enter. It had claimed others before her, and now, it was coming for her. Lily's legs finally gave out, her body too exhausted to run any longer. She fell to her knees, unable to tear her gaze from the roots as they slowly encircled her, drawing her closer to the earth. She could feel the ground beneath her shift, the pulse of something ancient reverberating through the soil. In the distance, she saw the figures again. They were coming, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The woman from before, the one with the hollow eyes, stood at the edge of the clearing, her twisted form beckoning her forward. Lily's mind reeled. She had to escape. But the forest had already claimed her. There was no way out. As the roots closed around her, the whispers grew into a deafening roar, and Lily's world was consumed by darkness. The forest had claimed another soul, and its hunger would never be satisfied. Lily's body was no longer her own. She felt herself being pulled down into the earth, the roots tightening around her limbs, their icy grip pulling her deeper, toward the center of the forest. The ground beneath her felt like it was alive, pulsating with the slow rhythm of some ancient heartbeat. Panic surged through her chest, and she tried to scream, but her mouth refused to work. The forest was silencing her, drawing her into its depths. The air around her thickened, a heavy presence enveloping her, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist into grotesque shapes, dancing just out of the corner of her vision. The whispers had stopped. Now, there was only a profound silence, the kind that presses in on your chest, making you feel as if you might suffocate. Yet, beneath it, something stirred, a force, ancient and insatiable. Her eyes were wide with fear as she looked around. The figures that had chased her earlier were now all around the clearing, standing in stillness, their hollow eyes locked on her. They were no longer moving, they didn't need to. They were part of the forest, and the forest was part of them. They had no need for flesh or breath. Their forms were like twisted reflections, bound to the land, their existence a tether between the living world and something far darker. The woman, the one with the gnarled, outstretched limbs, stepped forward again. Her face was a deathly mask, her eyes endless voids that swallowed all light. Lily could feel her gaze, like an invisible weight pressing on her chest, dragging her deeper into despair. "You belong to us now," the woman's voice echoed in Lily's mind, like 1,000 whispers blending into one. Lily wanted to fight. She wanted to scream, to tear herself free of the roots and run. But her body was weak, drained, the weight of the forest's presence too heavy. She tried to shift, to move, but the roots had twisted too tightly around her, locking her in place. It was as if she had become part of the forest itself, a sacrifice, an offering to whatever dark power ruled this place. The woman's face twisted into something that resembled a smile, though there was no warmth in it, only malice, ancient and cruel. The twisted figures around her began to move, their long limbs creaking like branches bending in the wind, as if waking from a deep slumber. "You have entered the realm of the Forsaken," the woman whispered, her voice as cold as the wind. "And here, no one leaves." The world around Lily seemed to warp and bend, as if reality itself was unraveling. The trees shifted, stretching impossibly high, their bark cracking like bones under pressure. The moon above, which had once seemed a gentle light, now hung low and red, casting everything in a blood-like hue. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and Lily felt her vision blur. The figures were closing in now, their shapes becoming clearer. Their faces, though human at first glance, were distorted by time and decay, their eyes vacant and endless, as though they had long since lost their souls. Some were pale, others covered in dark, mossy growths, their bodies twisted with the markings of the forest's curse. They were the lost, the ones who had ventured too far into the woods and had never returned. Now they were part of the forest, forever bound to it. Lily's breath was ragged, but her mind screamed for escape. She tried to think, tried to remember the stories she'd heard, the rumors about the haunted forest, but they were all a blur now, fading from her mind as the shadows crept in to fill the space. Was it true? Could she truly never leave? The thought of it consumed her, and a deep despair began to take root in her chest. Suddenly, a flash of movement broke through the stillness. A shadow darted across the clearing, quick and fleeting. For a brief moment, Lily thought she saw a figure, a person running through the trees, heading for the edge of the forest. Her heart skipped. Someone else had found their way into the forest, someone who might still have a chance to escape. But as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Lily's mind began to fragment, the reality around her warping even further. The whispering returned, louder now, suffocating, pressing in on her ears. The voices were everywhere, swirling like an unholy wind, and she could barely distinguish the words. "Join us," they seemed to chant. "Stay with us." Her eyes darted around in desperation, trying to find any sign of escape. And that's when she saw it, a faint light, a distant flicker between the trees. It was not like the moonlight. It was warmer, more inviting. Something human. Something that didn't belong in this cursed place. Without thinking, Lily fought against the roots, struggling with every ounce of strength she had left. Her hands were raw and trembling, but she clawed at the earth, digging, pulling at the twisted roots that bound her. Slowly, agonizingly, she freed one arm, then the other. With a final desperate pull, she tore herself loose, collapsing onto the ground. The figures around her stirred, their eyes flicking toward her. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Lily scrambled to her feet, her legs weak, her body trembling from exhaustion and terror. The light ahead, the one that had beckoned her, was still there, faint but real. Her heart pounded as she ran, ignoring the twisting pain in her chest, ignoring the way the trees seemed to bend toward her, as if trying to stop her. The ground beneath her feet cracked and shifted, but she forced herself to keep moving, her body moving on sheer instinct. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed through the forest, her eyes fixed on the light ahead. She could feel the presence behind her now, those hollow eyes watching, waiting. The voices were louder, more insistent, but she refused to listen. She couldn't. And then, just as the darkness threatened to overtake her, she stumbled into the clearing. The light was real. She was no longer surrounded by the twisted, gnarled trees. The air here felt different, lighter, clearer. Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. There were no figures, no whispers. Just an open space. A space that felt like salvation. But as she stood there, gasping for breath, Lily realized something horrifying. The light was not natural. It was a trap. The ground beneath her began to tremble again, and a sound like cracking branches echoed through the clearing. Her heart sank as she turned, slowly, toward the forest behind her. It wasn't the forest she had known, it was something else, something darker. And in the distance, she saw them, more figures, emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing brighter than ever. They weren't going to let her go. The woman, the one with the hollow eyes, was at the forefront, her twisted form moving like smoke in the wind. She smiled again, and this time, there was no mistake, she had won. There is no escape. Lily's scream was swallowed by the forest as it closed in on her. She could hear the roots stretching, the whispers of the damned growing louder. There was no escape. There was only the forest. Forever. The end.